You can't challenge me. You didn't just push my daughter. Andrew. You just knocked down the last wall, protecting your family. You don't understand anything. Andrew. Please stop. Elisa Ferraz walked into her husband's family dining room, believing she would face just another silent humiliation. Pregnant. Surrounded by cold stares and contracts on the table. She discovered they wanted to take away even her right to protect her own child. When Andrew lost control in front of everyone, Elisa's fall opened a door the Ferraz family should never have provoked. Outside that sprawling mansion in the Hamptons, a man no one knew was already on his way. Sign it. Elisa. Andrew Ferraz said. His voice level. As if the coldness made the command seem more elegant. The dining room of the Hamptons mansion was lit by crystal chandeliers. But nothing about it felt welcoming. On the dark mahogany table, between untouched glasses and porcelain plates, sat a navy blue folder with the subtle crest of the Ferraz family. Mrs. Eleanor kept her fingers on the rim of her glass and added. It's just a formality. Dear. Smart women don't cause a scene when they join a family like ours. Elisa, seated at the far end of the table, placed a hand over her 6-month belly and replied softly. My child is not a formality. One of Andrew's uncles let out a dry laugh. And Andrew leaned forward. You're confusing pregnancy with power. Elisa maîtrise gaze. And you're confusing marriage with possession. His mother tapped her nail against the crystal. Watch your tone. Andrew narrowed his eyes. You came here with no name. No fortune. And no protection. Elisa tightened the old ring on her finger. Perhaps you never asked where I came from. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was dangerous. This wasn't the first night Elisa had been placed at the center of the table. As if she were a problem to be solved. Since marrying Andrew, the Ferraz family had treated her discreet smile as weakness and her reserved background as poverty. To them, she was merely the simple girl the heir had chosen on a whim, useful now because she carried the first grandchild of their lineage. The contract stated in polite language that Elisa would waive any property claims on behalf of her child, until the family deemed it convenient to acknowledge future rights. It was a trap with the scent of legality. She read the first page, then the second, and felt something inside her break, not because of the paper, but because of the naturalness with which everyone expected her obedience. Outside, beyond the tall windows, New York City blazed with cars stuck on Fifth Avenue and helicopters crisscrossing the sky of powerful people. Inside that room, however, the world had shrunk to fit the distance between her hand and a silver pen. Mrs. Eleanor rose with the rehearsed grace of a woman accustomed to humiliating others without losing her composure. Her champagne dress shimmered under the light, and her emerald necklace seemed like a collar designed to remind everyone who was in charge. You need to understand one thing. Elisa. The Ferraz name isn't a free ride. It demands discipline. Silence. And gratitude. Elisa felt the baby move in her womb. A small push of life against an environment where everything reeked of control. Andrew watched his wife as if she were a difficult negotiation. Not the woman he had once sworn to protect. My mother is trying to prevent you from making a mistake, he said. What mistake? Elisa asked with a calm that further irritated the room. The mistake of thinking you can use this pregnancy to blackmail us. She took a deep breath. She didn't cry. This absence of tears bothered them more than any scream. Andrew. I never asked you for money. I never asked for a position. Jewelry. An apartment. Nothing. I asked for respect. He laughed joylessly. Respect is earned. Elisa closed the folder. Then today. You lost mine. The sentence cut across the table like a silent knife. One of Andrew's cousins averted his gaze. His elderly aunt clutched her chest. Not from compassion, but from fear of a scandal. Mrs. Eleanor's face hardened. And Andrew remained motionless for a few seconds. As if he didn't recognize the woman before him. Elisa realized at that moment that she had spent months trying to save a home that had never truly allowed her in. She remembered the times Mrs. Eleanor had corrected her in front of the staff. The doctor's appointments Andrew had promised to attend but never did. The late nights she had heard her husband discussing debts on the phone. Only for him to smile at breakfast, as if the family were invincible. On her finger. The old ring seemed to weigh heavier. It wasn't a wedding band, it was a piece of matte gold with a small dark stone. An heirloom her father had placed on her hand before the ceremony. Saying only that certain doors should only be opened when she chose to return. Elisa. Pick up the pen. Andrew ordered. His voice was no longer cold. It was too low. Laden with a shame he couldn't name. Shame at being challenged in front of his family. Shame at realizing his wife no longer trembled as before. She looked at the pen. Then at him. No. It was a short word. But it made Mrs. Eleanor lose her color. Andrew pushed his chair back forcefully. The sound grating against the marble floor. You won't turn my house into a stage. Elisa also stood slowly. One hand on the table. The other protecting her belly. Your house. I've slept here. I had lunch here. Smiled for your guests here. But it was never my home. You made sure to remind me of that every day. He moved closer. Don't challenge me. She smelled his expensive cologne. The same scent she had once associated with security. Now it smelled of threat. I'm not challenging you. Andrew. I'm choosing myself. No one moved when Andrew grabbed her arm. It wasn't an explosive gesture. It was worse because it came with the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Elisa tried to free herself without making a scene. But he tightened his grip. And the entire room pretended it was still just a marital argument. Let go of my arm. She said. You will sign. I won't. You have nowhere to go. Elisa looked at him with a sadness, so pure, it almost seemed like pity. That was the lie I tried hardest to believe. Andrew's face darkened. With a sudden movement. He pushed her away from the table. Elisa lost her balance. Her body hit the side of a chair. And she fell onto the thick rug. Protecting her belly. Before even thinking of herself. The impact caused a glass to tip over. And dark wine spread like a living stain across the white tablecloth. For 2 seconds. No one breathed. Then. Mrs. Eleanor whispered. Me God. Andrew, but she didn't rush to Elisa. Elisa lay on the floor. Her heart pounding. A dull pain in her arm. And a cold fear piercing her chest. There was no blood. No scream. But there was something irreparable about that position. Here. Pregnant on the dining room rug. Surrounded by an entire family who only now understood the gravity of the silence. Andrew reached out his hand too late. Elisa. Get up. It wasn't like that. She recoiled before he could touch her. The small gesture hurt him more than a slap. Don't come near me. Her voice was low but firm. The baby moved again. And she closed her eyes for an instant. Grateful to feel life where everyone else had tried to plant fear. Then? With effort. Elisa pulled her phone from the inside pocket of the light jacket she wore over her dress. The screen was cracked at the edge from the fall. She unlocked it with trembling fingers. Opened a saved contact. Simply labeled Dad. And typed a few words. Dad. Now I choose to come home. She sent it before Andrew understood. Mrs. Eleanor saw the gesture and finally approached. Not to help, but to snatch control from the air. Who are you messaging? Elisa. Don't be childish. We'll resolve this as a family. The word family made Elisa laugh silently. Family doesn't corner a pregnant woman to take away her own child's rights. Andrew ran a hand through his pale hair, trying to regain authority. You're overreacting. I lost my temper for a second. Elisa leaned on the chair and slowly began to rise, refusing everyone's hand. A second reveals more than years of speeches. One of the uncles murmured that this needed to stay between them. That there were staff in the house. That the Faraz name couldn't appear in condo gossip. Elisa then understood the whole truth. They weren't worried about her. They were worried about the door. About the walls. About what the security guards might hear. About the possibility that the world might discover that the elegance of that family was merely veneer over deep cracks. She stood, dizzy, but standing. Andrew's phone vibrated on the table. Then Mrs. Eleanor's vibrated. Then his uncle's. His cousins. The family's private lawyers. Who was waiting in an adjoining room, a series of notifications that sounded like rain against glass. Andrew picked up his device and turned pale in a different way. Not from guilt, but from professional fear. Why is the company's legal department calling me now, Mrs. Eleanor frowned. Answer it. Before he could touch the screen, car lights appeared through the main window. 3 black vehicles stopped in front of the mansion. 2 perfectly aligned to be a casual visit. The house's security guard rushed through the hallway, losing some of his composure, and whispered something into Mrs. Eleanor's ear. Her face hardened. Octavius Ferraz. She repeated, as if the name had entered the room before the man himself. Elisa closed her eyes. Not from relief, but from acceptance. Andrew looked at her. Who is Octavius Ferraz? For the first time that night, Elisa didn't answer. She let the silence do what she had done for too long, carry the truth. The double doors of the room opened without violence, but with an authority that made everyone take a step back. Octavius Ferraz entered first. In a dark suit, impeccably gray hair, and an expression too serene for the scene he found. Behind him came 4 lawyers, 2 assistants, and Michael Arantes. A tall man with an attentive gaze carrying a leather briefcase without haste. Michael saw Elisa before he saw anyone else. His eyes dropped to her hand on her belly, then to the red mark on her arm. And something in his posture changed. Andrew tried to speak first, because men like him believed the first voice could still save the narrative. Sir, there's been a family misunderstanding. Octavius didn't look at him immediately. He walked to Elisa, stopped at a respectful distance, and asked, My daughter, can you stand? The entire room seemed to lose its footing. Mrs. Eleanor clutched her necklace. Andrew opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Elisa felt it. Her eyes shining with tears, she still refused to shed. Octavius then turned to Andrew. He didn't yell, didn't point a finger. His calm was more frightening than any threat. You didn't just push my daughter, Andrew. You just knocked down the last wall protecting your family. Andrew recoiled half a step. Your daughter, Mrs. Eleanor tried to regain her composure. Mr. Ferraz. If we had known, Octavius cut her off with a look. You knew she was human. That was enough. Michael stepped closer to Elisa and spoke softly. Careful not to touch her. Without permission. Elisa. I'm Michael Arantes. Your father asked me to come with the team. Do you authorize us to call your doctor and formally record what happened here? Elisa looked at Andrew. At the navy blue folder on the table. At the wine staining the tablecloth. At all the faces that had once judged her small. Then she took a deep breath and replied. I authorize it. And no one here touches my son. Andrew took a desperate step. Elisa. For God's sake. She stared at him. You should have remembered God before raising your hand against my dignity. Michael opened his leather briefcase. And the sound of the clasp seemed like the beginning of a sentence. One of Octavius's lawyers handed documents to the Ferraz family lawyer, who had emerged in the hallway with a crooked tie and the devastated expression of someone who recognized names before even reading the pages. Octavius didn't speak of money, he didn't need to. He spoke of legal measures for preserving evidence. Immediate protection. Formal communication to relevant agencies. And corporate boards involved in the contracts under review. Clean words. Dirty consequences for those who had something to hide. Mrs. Eleanor slowly sat down. As if her legs couldn't bear the weight of the family name. Andrew looked at Elisa as if seeing her for the first time. And at the same time, realizing he had never truly seen her. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She merely took off her wedding ring and placed it on the table. Away from the folder, they wanted her to sign. The old Ferraz ring remained on her hand. When Elisa walked toward the exit, Michael accompanied her a few steps behind. Attentive. Without invading her space. Octavius stayed behind for an instant. Facing the Ferraz family, like someone closing a heavy door. In the marble hall, the air seemed less suffocating. Though the security guards, lawyers, and black cars made it impossible to feign normalcy. Andrew appeared behind her. His voice broken for the first time. Elisa. I'm your husband. She stopped without turning immediately. For months. That sentence would have hurt. That night, it sounded small. No. She finally said. Looking over her shoulder. You were the man who should have protected me. Today. You became the reason I need to leave. Michael lowered his eyes as if that sentence also struck an old chord within him. Octavius extended his hand to his daughter. But let her choose whether or not to take it. Elisa descended the steps alone. Only later accepting support. And, when she got into the black car. Under the cold lights of New York City. The Ferraz mansion was left behind. Like a house beginning to crumble from within, the black car left the Ferraz mansion unhurriedly. As if its very slowness was a form of sentence. Elisa sat in the back seat. One hand on her belly. The other clenched around the old Ferraz ring. Beside her. Octavius asked no useless questions. Only observed his daughter's face with a pain too contained to fit into the silence. Michael Orantes followed in the front seat. Speaking softly on the phone. Organizing medical care. Security. Formale registration. And a support team. Without turning Elisa's fragility into a spectacle. When the vehicle entered Park Avenue and the lights of New York City began to pass like golden streaks through the windows. Elisa finally said. I don't want you to destroy everything for me. Octavius turned his face slowly. I didn't come to destroy for you. I came to prevent them from continuing to destroy you. She closed her eyes. I waited too long. Her father's voice didn't soften. But it grew lower. You chose to love. Their mistake was confusing love with permission. Michael heard the sentence through the rearview mirror. But didn't allow himself to look for long. He had known Octavius Ferraz for years, and knew that the man rarely let emotion show in public. Even so. That night. His pain filled the entire car. Elisa. For her part. didn't look like the secret heiress who would bring down a powerful family. She looked merely like a pregnant woman trying to maintain her breath after discovering her home had never been home. When her phone vibrated, Andrew's name appeared on the screen. A call. Then another. Then a short message. Elisa. Answer. We need to talk before this turns into a tragedy. She read without responding. Michael finally spoke carefully. You don't need to answer anything now. Elisa raised her eyes to him through the rearview mirror. Do you speak as a lawyer or as someone who already knows what a family like theirs does when they lose control? Michael paused for a second. As both. Octavius noticed the attention but didn't intervene. For the first time that night, his daughter seemed to ask a question. Not to be saved, but to understand the battlefield. In Octavius's secure penthouse apartment, near one of New York City's most exclusive neighborhoods, everything was glass. Concrete. Bright. And expensive silence. The city sparkled below, indifferent to the fall of a woman and the beginning of a family name's ruin. An obstetrician arrived even before Elisa took off her coat, accompanied by a discreet nurse. Michael remained outside the room by the door, while Octavius paced back and forth with an untouched glass of water in his hand. Will she be all right? Her father asked. And that was the first sentence where his voice cracked. The doctor replied with quiet firmness that she would examine everything carefully. That Elisa needed rest. And that the baby showed stable signs at that moment. Elisa listened and finally let a tear escape. Not for Andrew. Nor for the Ferraz family. But for the relief of feeling that the life within her still resisted. When the doctor asked for authorization to document the marks on her arm, Elisa nodded. Document everything. Not for revenge, but so that no one can say tomorrow that I made it up. While Elisa was being attended to, Michael received the first reports from the team that had stayed at the mansion. The Ferraz family's private lawyer had signed receipt of the initial notifications, but Mrs. Eleanor had refused to hand over the internal recordings of the dining room. This alone spoke volumes. On Michael's phone, messages arrived from 3 fronts: the corporate team, the family team, and the financial investigators Octavius had maintained in silence for months. He entered the apartment's office, where Octavius awaited him before a too-clean desk. They'll try to turn Elisa into an opportunist by tomorrow morning, Michael said. Octavius nodded. Mrs. Eleanor always preferred to kill reputations before documents reached the table. Michael opened his leather briefcase. The contract they tried to make Elisa sign is fragile. But it reveals intent. And the aggression changes everything. Octavius looked at the closed door of the room where his daughter was. I should have brought Elisa back sooner. Michael didn't soften. She wouldn't have come. Her father closed his eyes for an instant. I know. That's the punishment. At the Ferraz mansion, elegance had transformed into organized panic. Mrs. Eleanor ordered the wine-stained tablecloth replaced. As if erasing a stain could erase the entire night. Andrew paced the room, his face still white, his phone glued to his hand. Who is Octavius Ferraz? Really? He asked the family lawyer. The man took too long to answer. A name your family should have respected before provoking. Mrs. Eleanor turned with fury. Don't talk to me as if we're finished. The lawyer took a deep breath. Do you understand what it means for Ferraz Capital to review contracts linked to the Ferraz Group? Andrew's uncle murmured that it was impossible. That the Ferraz family never appeared. Never gave interviews. Never got directly involved. Mrs. Eleanor clutched her emerald necklace. She was his daughter and never said anything. Andrew stopped. For the first time, the question didn't sound like an accusation against Elisa. It sounded like a confession of ignorance. Octavius Faraz's name circulated in the American financial world, like a door without a doorknob. Everyone knew it existed. Few entered. He didn't appear on magazine covers. Didn't give speeches about power. Didn't smile at charity galas to buy admiration. His investments emerged like shadows in major restructurings. Private banks. Credit funds. Companies that survived because someone invisible had decided they were still worth the risk. Andrew knew this now, too late. As he listened to his lawyer explain that some of the loans sustaining the Faraz Group had passed through funds linked to Faraz capital structures. Mrs. Eleanor tried to regain control with the old venom. So she entered this family spying on us. Andrew repeated the idea. But his voice wasn't as sure. The lawyer shook his head. No. From what I see. She entered as a wife. You tried to turn her into a signature. The sentence fell over the room like a clean slap. Back at the penthouse. Elisa emerged from the medical evaluation with slow steps. A light blanket draped over her shoulders. Octavius immediately stood but stopped before touching her. He now understood that love could also suffocate when it came in the form of control. Elisa noticed the interrupted gesture. And it hurt her in a different way. You can hug me. Dad. Octavius crossed the distance with an almost painful swiftness and embraced her carefully. As if she were still the little girl who ran through the corridors of the old Faraz home in Boston. Before learning that family names could attract predators. I'm so sorry, he said. Elisa closed her eyes. You knew they had debts. It wasn't a question. Octavius didn't lie. I knew the Faraz family was vulnerable. I didn't know how far they would go with you. She pulled away just enough to face him. But you suspected Andrew. His silence answered before his voice. You suspected the system that created Andrew. Elisa felt anger rise hot. Mixed with exhaustion. And still, you let me marry him. Octavius received the accusation without defense. I let you choose. Perhaps I confused respect with cowardice. Michael entered only when Elisa authorized it. He carried documents but didn't place them before her immediately. Before any action. You need to decide what you want to do today. Not what your father wants. Nor what Faraz's capital can do. What do you want? Elisa looked at that distinction intently. Since her marriage. Everyone had spoken around her. As if her body. Her child. And her future were matters of family. Business. Or reputation. Michael was the first that night to put the decision back in her hands. I want out of that marriage. She said. The sentence startled her after being spoken. But it also opened space in her chest. Octavius slowly closed his hand. As if restraining the urge to celebrate. Michael merely felt it. Then we start with formal protection. Legal separation. Preservation of evidence. And direct communication only through lawyers. As for the baby. We'll ensure no property decision is made without legal supervision. Elisa breathed. And his family. Michael looked at Octavius. Then back at her. His family will try to attack your reputation before losing control of their own. The prediction came true before dawn. At 5:03 a.m. An anonymous note began circulating among business columnists and profiles, specializing in the inner workings of the New York elite. The text insinuated that Elisa, Andrew Faraz's pregnant wife, had abandoned the home after a financial argument and threatened to use her pregnancy for advantage. It was subtle enough to appear as information from a close source. Cruel enough to bear Mrs. Eleanor's fingerprints. Michael showed the screen to Elisa only after she had coffee and heard the doctor again that she should rest. She read everything in silence. Octavius, by the window, seemed about to buy every newspaper in the country just to shut them down. Elisa calmly put down the cup. They've started. Michael replied. Yes. She looked at her own reflection in the glass pail. With dark circles. But resolute. Then I won't hide like a guilty party. Octavius turned. Elisa. She raised her hand. No. Dad. This time, I'll speak before they speak for me. Michael observed her as one recognizes a change no document can record. The woman who had left the mansion laden with pain was now beginning to reorganize her own voice. It wasn't impulsivity, it was a boundary. He approached the table and opened a clean notepad. We can prepare a short statement. Without intimate details. Without unnecessary exposure. But firm enough to prevent them from controlling the narrative. Elisa nodded. I wanted to say only that I am safe. Accompanied by my medical and legal team. And that any attempt to manipulate facts involving my pregnancy will be dealt with legally. Octavius raised an eyebrow. Almost proud. My daughter is back. Elisa looked at him with tired tenderness. Not yet. I just stopped running away. Michael wrote the sentence. But inside. He felt she had said something greater. Andrew could have pushed Elisa in front of the family. Mrs. Eleanor could try to push her in front of public opinion. But in that penthouse above New York City, Elisa finally planted her feet on her own ground. That same morning, Andrew appeared at the gate of Octavius's building without warning. He couldn't get past the reception. The doorman, briefed by a security team that asked no questions, maintained a polite voice while informing him that Elisa would not be receiving visitors. Andrew looked at the cameras. The discreet security guards. The clean street where executive cars stopped without fanfare. For the first time, he felt what Elisa had felt for months, being outside a door that someone more powerful could keep closed. He called her again. The call didn't go through. He sent un message. Elisa. I made mistakes. But you can't destroy my family. On the high floor. Elisa received the message while Michael reviewed the final statement. She showed her phone to the lawyer. He still thinks his family is the victim. Michael replied with quiet harshness. Men like Andrew only call it destruction the moment they lose the right to destroy others. Elisa didn't smile. But that sentence remained with her like new protection. When the statement was sent, the effect was immediate. It didn't reveal the Faraz name in a threatening tone. Didn't detail the violence. Didn't turn Elisa's pain into a spectacle. It simply stated that she was under medical and legal care. That formal measures would be taken. And that any attempt to distort the facts would be met within the law. The signature, however, changed everything. Elisa Ferraz. Represented by Michael Arantes and the legal team of Faraz Capital. In less than 20 minutes, the same columnists who had received the anonymous note began deleting phrases, revising headlines, seeking confirmation. In the Faraz family's internal group chat, silence turned to panic. Mrs. Eleanor read the name Faraz repeatedly, as if she could tear it from the screen with her eyes. Andrew sat alone in the mansion's study, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who seemed to judge him. He realized too late that he hadn't pushed a defenseless woman. He had pushed the only person who still could have chosen to save him. At the end of that afternoon, Elisa asked to spend a few minutes alone on the apartment's enclosed balcony. New York City stretched before her. Immense. Noisy. Alive. With its glass buildings and impatient avenues. Octavia stayed inside, respecting the distance. Michael left the initial separation documents on the table. Without rushing her to sign immediately, Elisa touched her belly and spoke softly, as if talking to her child. I promise you'll never learn that love is fear. Michael heard it unintentionally and turned his face out of respect. Octavius heard it too. And his eyes filled with an ancient guilt. At that moment, Elisa understood that the arrival of her father and the lawyers was not the end of the war. It was just the beginning. Andrew would still fight for his version. Mrs. Eleanor would still try to save the family name. And she would still need to face the pain of admitting she had loved a man capable of confusing strength with cruelty. But there was a difference. Now, when night fell over New York City, Elisa would no longer be kneeling on anyone's rug. The next morning brought no peace. Just a more elegant form of war. Elisa awoke in the white bedroom of Octavius's apartment with the sensation that she had slept inside glass too thin to feel safe. One that seemed safe until the first crack. The doctor had recommended rest. But her body couldn't rest while her phone vibrated with news. Blocked messages. And headlines rewritten every hour. The statements signed by her legal team had prevented the Ferris family from completely dominating the narrative, but it didn't erase the venom already spread in closed groups of the New York elite. She was now called an ungrateful wife. An ambitious pregnant woman. A woman who had hidden her own family name to set a trap. Elisa read one of these phrases by mistake and felt her stomach churn. Michael, sitting at the living room table with a pile of documents, noticed the change in her face. "Don't read alone," he said without harshness. Elisa clenched her phone. "They're talking about my son." Michael slowly closed the folder. "Then we'll make sure they answer for every word." Octavius wanted to prevent her from attending that afternoon's meeting. But Elisa refused with the same calm she had used with Andrew. "Dad. If it's about me, I'm staying." He ran a hand through his gray hair. A rare gesture for a man who controlled even his breathing in front of adversaries. "You need to protect yourself." She held his gaze. "That's exactly the phrase that kept me silent for too long." The blow struck Octavius with precision. Michael observed the two without interfering. Realizing that this war wasn't just against the Ferrazes, it was also against a type of love that protects by hiding, decides in silence, and then calls silence care. Elisa sat at the glass table. Still pale, but erect. The Ferraz ring gleamed discreetly on her hand. Unlike the wedding band that had been left on the stained table in the mansion. "I want to know everything," she said. Octavius took a deep breath. "Everything can hurt," Elisa replied without blinking. "Yesterday I discovered that not knowing also hurts." Michael opened the first report. There was no drama in his voice. And perhaps because of that, each piece of information seemed even heavier. The Ferraz family faced an old financial crisis. Hidden beneath appearances. Business magazine covers. And carefully cultivated social alliances. Some group companies had been used to cover losses of others. And collateral contracts circulated among family holdings, as if they were pieces exchanged in a private game. None of that was explained with overly technical terms. Michael knew Elisa didn't need a lecture on the market. She needed to understand how her life had entered that mechanism. 3 months before your wedding," he said, sliding a printed copy to her. "Mrs. Eleanor sought a consultancy to map possible connections that would bring the Ferraz group closer to less exposed credit sources." Elisa read the page. But the letters seemed to move. There were dates. Meetings. And her name circled in a note: Elisa Ferraz. Discreet profile. Only daughter. No public exposure. Herr Hartzunk. "They knew who I was," Octavius replied softly. Mrs. Eleanor suspected. The revelation opened a new pain. Different from the fall. Different from the humiliations. Elisa thought of the beginning of her marriage. Of Andrew's gestures, which she had interpreted as romantic courage. He had introduced her to his family. saying he didn't care about background. That he was tired of women interested in family names. That with her, everything seemed simple. Now, that simplicity took on another dimension. Perhaps Andrew didn't know the whole truth. Perhaps he knew enough to accept his mother's direction. This uncertainty was almost worse. Did he choose me or use me? Elisa asked. And the question didn't seem aimed at anyone. Michael was silent for an instant, as if measuring how much an honest answer could hurt. We still don't know how much Andrew participated before the wedding. But we know that afterwards, he allowed you to be pressured. Elisa closed her eyes. The baby moved, and she rested her hand on her belly like someone holding her own world. I built memories on ground that may never have existed. At the Ferret's mansion, Andrew also sought solid ground and found only cracks. He had spent the night sleepless, alternating between anger, fear, and a guilt that appeared in flashes too quick to turn into true regret. In the library, Mrs. Eleanor received 2 communication consultants and the family lawyer. Her plan was simple and cruel: to portray Elisa as a manipulative woman who had infiltrated the family by hiding her parentage. To suggest emotional instability due to pregnancy. And to present Andrew as a husband cornered by financial threats. Andrew listened to everything with his arms crossed. Until a sentence made him react. "We're not going to say she faked the fall," he said. Mrs. Eleanor met his gaze coldly. "No one needs to say she faked it. Just suggest she exaggerated." He stared at his mother. "I pushed her." The room went still. Mrs. Eleanor slowly approached. "You lost control in a private discussion. Don't hand the knife to someone who wants to cut your throat." Andrew whispered more to himself than to her. "She was pregnant." Mrs. Eleanor replied without hesitation. "And that's why she's dangerous." His mother's phrase remained in Andrew's head like an indelible stain. Dangerous. Elisa, who asked if he wanted coffee before difficult meetings. Who saved the invitations to medical appointments, hoping he would show up. Who smiled at Mrs. Eleanor even after being corrected in front of the staff. Dangerous. For the first time, the word didn't fit. But Andrew still didn't know if his guilt was love or fear of losing. When he entered the bedroom he had shared with Elisa, he found her closet almost intact: light dresses, maternity books, a box of letters she had never sent. On the dresser, there was a small baby bracelet bought in a discreet store in New York City with a tag still attached. He held it and felt a pain he didn't know where to place. His phone vibrated. It was Mrs. Eleanor, demanding he come down to record an audio message for the family's allies. Andrew looked in the mirror and saw a man who had always believed that control was strength. Now his image seemed only that of someone small, trying to wear a too large family name. In Octavius's apartment, the afternoon brought a new piece to the board. A woman named Sylvia appeared, accompanied by one of Faraz Capital's investigators. She was a former assistant to Mrs. Eleanor, fired months earlier under the vague accusation of breach of trust. She wore simple clothes, carried a worn purse, and kept her hands so tightly clasped that her knuckles were white. Elisa vaguely recognized her from an old dinner, when Mrs. Eleanor had called her useless for serving coffee at the wrong temperature. Michael offered water and assured her she wasn't obligated to speak without formal protection. Sylvia looked at Elisa, and for an instant, shame overcame fear. "I saw you crying in the mansion hallway once. I should have said something." Elisa didn't respond with accusation. "Why did you come now?" The woman pulled a small USB drive from her purse. "Because Mrs. Eleanor told me to delete emails. I deleted them from her computer." But I saved a copy first. Michael didn't touch the object immediately. He first asked, "Do you know what this contains?" Sylvia nodded. The reason they wanted the baby to have no clear rights. Sylvia's material didn't solve everything. But it connected dots that had previously floated as suspicions. There were messages about the contract Elisa had been pressured to sign. Instructions to reduce any possibility of future inheritance disputes. And a specific exchange between Mrs. Eleanor and an external consultant about the risk of the Faraz name becoming public before the group's debts were stabilized. In one of the messages, the phrase was short and devastating. "As long as the girl believes she's alone, she'll sign anything to protect her child." Elisa read that line several times. She didn't cry. It was as if a part of her had spent the entire night crying inside and was now dry. Octavius turned his face, consumed by silent fury. Michael, beside her, kept his voice low. "This shows intent. We'll still need to validate the origin, context, and integrity of the files." Elisa nodded. "Do everything properly. I don't want to win with dirt." Michael looked at her with something that transcended professionalism. "That's exactly why they're afraid of you." The sentence hung between the two for a second too long. Elisa noticed and looked away first. Not out of rejection, but out of fear of what any tenderness might mean when her marriage was still bleeding. Michael also retreated. Disciplined. Storing feelings in the same place where he kept dangerous documents. Octavius, however, saw it. And for the first time, the father didn't seem bothered. Perhaps because Michael didn't look at Elisa as property to protect, nor as fragility to manage. He looked at her as someone who awaited her permission even to approach her pain. Still, Elisa didn't want to confuse security with love. She had done that once before. At the end of the meeting, she asked to speak to her father alone. Michael left without asking. When the door closed, Elisa placed the USB drive on the table. "You had people investigating my married life." Octavius didn't deny it. "I had people observing risks around you." She took a deep breath. "Those are pretty words for saying you distrusted my husband and didn't tell me." His face aged a few years. "I was afraid of losing you." The confession healed nothing, it only made the wound more honest. Elisa stood and walked to the window, watching New York City change color as evening fell. "Dad, when Mom died, you promised you would never decide my life for me." Octavius closed his eyes, hearing the memory of his wife. "I tried to keep that promise." Elisa turned. "No. You tried to protect me without letting me know the danger. That's not freedom." His reply came hoarsely. "I thought if I revealed my suspicions, you'd think I was buying your choice." Elisa felt like hugging him and screaming at him at the same time. "And now I discover that everyone knew more about my marriage than I did." Octavius bowed his head. The man who made bankers fall silent before him couldn't sustain his daughter's gaze. "You're right." For Elisa, that sentence was harder than any defense. Because she still loved him, and because loving someone didn't erase the right to demand that person also answer for their choices. That night, Andrew managed to send an audio message that bypassed the blocks via an unknown number. Elisa saw it only because Michael was by her side. And because she decided she wouldn't run from his voice. "Elisa, I didn't know everything. My mother did things without telling me. I made mistakes. I admit it. But you know our marriage wasn't a complete lie. Don't let your father destroy my family. Think about our son." The last sentence made something inside her harden. Our son. The same son whose rights he had tried to reduce to a signature. Elisa didn't respond with audio. She asked Michael to register the message and add it to the documents. Then, against everyone's silent advice. She wrote a single reply. Andrew. Our son will be protected precisely because I stopped believing your promises. She sent it and turned off her phone. Michael observed her face. This might provoke him. Elisa rested both hands on the table. Tired but whole. Everything provokes men who think obedience is peace. That chapter of the war closed late. When the lights of Wall Street still shone in many offices, and expensive coffees were served to people who called ruin restructuring. Michael returned to Faraz Capital headquarters to validate Sylvia's files while Octavius remained in the apartment with his daughter. Finally respecting her silence, Elisa stayed awake past midnight. Sitting by the window. Thinking of Andrew. Mrs. Eleanor. Her father. Her son. And the woman she had been before, accepting crumbs of respect in exchange for an apparent family. The most painful thing wasn't discovering that the Faraz family wanted to use her, it was admitting that a part of her had seen the signs and chosen to call light normal marital difficulties. When Michael sent a short message saying the initial data seemed authentic, Elisa didn't feel victory, she felt responsibility. The next day, she would have to decide if she was ready to turn her pain into public evidence. And, for the first time since the fall, she was afraid not of losing Andrew, but of discovering that the woman who still loved him would need to die for her son's mother to live. At Noah M. The main boardroom of Faraz Holdings, atop a mirrored building on Wall Street, seemed prepared for a routine crisis meeting. But the atmosphere betrayed something else. Men in dark suits flipped through reports without reading them. Women on the board exchanged brief glances. And Andrew's chair at the head of the table seemed larger than him. Mrs. Eleanor sat to her son's right. Impeccable. Wearing the same emerald necklace from the night Elisa had fallen on the rug. That repetition wasn't a distraction, it was defiance. She wanted to show that she was still standing. That the Faraz family still had prestige, luxury, and control. Andrew, however, couldn't maintain the same mask. His fingers tapped the table at irregular intervals. And each time the door opened, he looked up like a defendant awaiting sentencing. She's not coming. Mrs. Eleanor said in a firm whisper. Pregnant women think of scandal before they think of courage. Andrew didn't respond. For the first time, he feared his mother didn't know Elisa as well as she imagined. The door opened at 9:17. First entered Michael Orantes. With a black briefcase in his hands and a calm that irritated half the room. Then came two lawyers from Faraz Capital. A governance consultant. And Sylvia. Mrs. Eleanor's former assistant. Visibly nervous, but supported by a formality that prevented her from appearing fragile. Octavius Faraz entered next. Without haste. And the silence changed its nature. It was no longer expectation, it was recognition. Finally, Elisa walked through the door wearing a light dress. No flashy jewelry. One hand resting on her belly, and the old Faraz ring, shining like a point of truth amidst the room's veneer. Andrew immediately stood. Elisa. She didn't look at him first. She looked at the table. At the chairs. At the faces that had discussed her future without her presence for too long. Only then did she say, in a low voice. Today. No one speaks for me. Octavius stopped behind her. Not beside her. It was a silent way of saying that this decision was hers. Mrs. Eleanor smiled like someone who still believed in the power of venomous elegance. Elisa. Darling. This is a business meeting. Your condition requires rest. Not exposure. Elisa pulled out a chair and sat down without asking permission. My condition requires respect. It's precisely the lack of it that brought us here. A board member cleared his throat. Trying to regain the corporate ritual, Michael placed the documents on the table and spoke with precision. We are here to address 3 points: the attempted coercion for the signing of a property rights waiver involving an unborn child, the preservation of evidence related to the incident at the Ferris residence, and the initiation of an independent audit of contracts linked to cross-credit operations. Mrs. Eleanor laughed softly. You've come to turn a family squabble into a financial spectacle. Octavius replied for the first time without changing his tone. It was you who turned a pregnant woman into an instrument of asset shielding. We merely brought light to the table. Andrew closed his eyes for a second. He knew the word light was dangerous for a family full of dark files. The Ferraz's lawyer tried to attack the validity of the documents before they were displayed. He said that digital files could be tampered with, that a resentful ex-employee should not be considered a reliable source, that Faraz Capital had obvious economic interests in weakening the group. Michael listened to everything without interrupting. When the man finished, he slid 3 authenticated copies to the center of the table. That's why we're not just presenting digital files. We have calendar records, copies forwarded to external emails, preserved data, and preliminary confirmation of origin by an independent technical team. Sylvia took a deep breath. And Elisa realized that the woman was trembling, not from lying, but from having waited too long to tell the truth. Mrs. Eleanor turned to her with contempt. You were always weak. Sylvia raised her face. No. I just depended on the salary you used to buy my silence. The sentence hit the board members harder than any report. For the first time, someone without an important family name hurt Mrs. Eleanor in public. Then, Michael displayed the central message. The one that had turned suspicions into structure. As long as the girl believes she's alone, she'll sign anything to protect her child. The phrase appeared on the boardroom screen. Too enlarged to be ignored. Elisa felt her stomach clench but didn't look away. Andrew looked at his mother. Did you write that, Mrs.? Eleanor kept her chin high. I wrote a risk assessment. Elisa finally faced her husband. I was your wife. Andrew. Your son was life. To her, we were a risk. Andrew opened his mouth, but found no defense that wouldn't also condemn him. One of the oldest board members asked when the family had become aware of Elisa's possible connection to Octavius Faraz. Michael turned another page. Before the marriage, there were indirect inquiries about her profile. After the marriage, attempts were made to limit any future rights. Without revealing to the board the real nature of her relationship with the Faraz family, Octavius added coldly. And before anyone suggests opportunism, I note that my daughter never asked Faraz Capital for a cent to interfere in this company. You were the ones who sought shortcuts. Andrew suddenly stood, as if his body needed to act, because his conscience could no longer bear to sit still. Elisa. I didn't know about that message. She looked at him with a firm sadness. But you knew about the contract. He stood motionless. My mother said it was protection. Elisa breathed slowly. Protection against whom? Against a child not yet born, against a wife who waited for you at appointments. Against a woman you allowed to be humiliated because it was easier to call silence maturity. Each question peeled away a depth layer of him in front of the room. Mrs. Eleanor tried to intervene. Andrew. Sit down. But he didn't sit. His mother's command, once absolute, began to fail. Elisa continued without raising her voice. You may not have written all the emails. You may not have created all the strategies. But you were there when they tried to force me to sign. You were there when I said no. You were there when your hand decided for your anger. Andrew braced his hands on the table. I'll answer for this. His mother turned away, shocked. Not by the guilt, but by the disobedience. Mrs. Eleanor realized she was losing her son in front of witnesses and tried to do what she had always done best. Turn fear into morality. You are destroying a respected American family because of an unfortunate incident. Elisa stood up. The room followed her movement as if she had pulled everyone by an invisible thread. No. Mrs. Eleanor. An unfortunate incident is knocking over a glass. What happened in that mansion was the consequence of months of contempt. She walked to the screen. And for an instant, the image of her face reflected over her mother-in-law's cruel phrase. You called me alone. Simple. Convenient. Grateful. You turned my pregnancy into currency. Called my silence weakness. Today I've come to correct only one thing. She touched the Faraz ring. I was never alone. I merely chose not to use my family name as a weapon. But when you touched my son, you confused my choice with an absence of limits. Octavius closed his eyes for a second. Not from shame, but from painful pride. Michael didn't smile. But for the first time, he allowed admiration to show without disguise. The moment everyone expected destruction came with a surprise. Octavius had the power to demand accelerated maturity of collateral. Pressure creditors. Activate clauses. And push the Faraz group into an immediate public collapse. Mrs. Eleanor knew this. Andrew did too. Some board members already had the faces of those calculating their own escape. But Elisa raised her hand before her father spoke. I do not authorize a punishment designed to satisfy anger. The room seemed not to understand. Mrs. Eleanor blinked in confusion. Elisa continued. I want an independent audit. Temporary removal of Andrew from any decisions related to family assets and contracts under review. Full preservation of the mansion's recordings. And formal recognition of my son's legal protection. I want every attempt to defame me withdrawn and documented. And I want my divorce conducted without blackmail. Michael noted each point. Though he already knew them, that was Elisa's strength, not to destroy out of impulse, but to strip her enemies of the right to continue lying. Octavius accepted with a slight nod. Andrew slumped into his chair. Not from relief, but because he understood that she didn't need to crush him to defeat him. It was then that the Faraz's lawyer received a message and turned pale. He discreetly showed it to Mrs. Eleanor. But Michael noticed the gesture. Any problem? The man didn't respond. Minutes later, the news arrived from another source. The internal recording of the dining room, which Mrs. Eleanor had claimed was unavailable due to a technical failure, had been automatically preserved on a third-party residential security server. Sylvia, before being fired, had maintained administrative access to backup notifications and had delivered the identification key to the technical team. Mrs. Eleanor lost her composure for the first time. That woman stole private information. Sylvia, still trembling, replied. No. I prevented you from erasing an assault. The word assault resonated through the room without needing to be shouted. Andrew covered his face with his hands. Elisa remained standing. But her body showed the weight of that new blow. Knowing the scene existed, that her fall could be seen, brought her no pleasure, it brought nausea. Michael approached close enough to speak softly. You decide when and how this will be used. She nodded. It won't be a spectacle. It will be evidence. With the recording preserved. The board members' resistance shifted. No one wanted to be seen defending a family that had tried to force a pregnant woman to sign a waiver after a fall provoked by her own husband. An independent director requested an emergency vote to remove Andrew from executive functions during the investigation. Another requested the immediate formation of an external audit committee, Mrs. Eleanor tried to speak. But her voice, once sharp, came out hoarse. Are you going to betray our name out of fear of the Ferrazes? A board member replied without looking at her. No. Eleanor. We're trying to save the company from what your family did. Andrew listened to the vote as if each yes removed a brick from the house where he had grown up. When the result was announced, he was no longer the center of the Ferraz group. He was the problem to be isolated. Mrs. Eleanor looked at Elisa with pure hatred. But found something she didn't expect: pity, not weak, pity. Pity for a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting a family name and in the end would be remembered for exposing it. The meeting ended without applause. Without shouts. Without the theatricality that Mrs. Eleanor could turn into victimhood. This was the worst defeat for her. Everything happened by minutes. Signature. Deliberation. And record. Ruin entered through the door of legality. Andrew followed Elisa to the corridor, ignoring Michael's warning to keep his distance. Just answer me one thing, he pleaded, his voice broken. At some point today, did you still love me? Elisa stopped before the private elevator. The question was cruel precisely because there was truth in it. The part of me that loved you still exists, Andrew. But it can no longer decide for me. He swallowed hard. I can change. She looked at him. And for an instant, saw the man she had fallen in love with, hidden beneath layers of fear, pride, and obedience to his mother. Perhaps you can. But not as my husband. Not now. The elevator door opened. Michael remained silently by her side, not turning that pain into a dispute. Elisa entered first. Before the doors closed, Andrew whispered, "I'm sorry." She replied only, "Apologies without consequence are just another way of asking me to carry your guilt." On the ground floor, business journalists were already gathered behind dividers. Informed by leaks no one admitted, flashes tried to penetrate the glass. But the security team maintained enough distance so Elisa wouldn't feel hunted. Octavius approached her and spoke softly. "You were fairer than they deserved." Elisa looked at the bustling street of Wall Street. At the buildings where so many people decided destinies with clean spreadsheets and dirty intentions. "I didn't do it for them. I did it for myself. I don't want my son to be born of revenge." Michael listened and kept that sentence as if it were a judgment more powerful than any contract. When the car arrived, Elisa didn't get in immediately. She turned to the building and saw Mrs. Eleanor behind a high window, small due to the distance. Still, like a queen without a kingdom. Andrew didn't appear. Perhaps he was finally understanding that falling before a woman he had pushed down was different from kneeling for love. Elisa touched her belly and breathed. The main battle had been won. But the healing hadn't even begun. Andrew Ferraz's removal didn't shut down the city. Didn't stop the elevators on Wall Street. Didn't close the Hamptons restaurants. New York City continued to function with its usual haste. As if the fall of an heir were just another piece of news among contracts. Traffic. And bitter coffee served in small cups. For Elisa. However, the world had shifted. She spent the following days between medical appointments, brief legal meetings, and long periods of silence in her father's penthouse. Michael's team prevented new anonymous notes from circulating without response. And the independent audit began collecting documents that once seemed untouchable. Mrs. Eleanor, who for years had reigned in gilded ballrooms and family lunches, was now called to explain decisions she had always believed were beyond question. Andrew left the president's office without a public statement. He exited through a side door of the building, surrounded by advisors, with The face of someone who still didn't understand that losing power was different from losing Elisa. Elisa watched only a snippet of the news. Then turned off the television. "I don't need to see him fall to know I've risen," she said. And Michael, sitting across the table, silently stored that sentence. At the Ferrat's mansion, ruin arrived. Not with screams, but with boxes. First came the auditors. Then the external lawyers. Then board members who once kissed Mrs. Eleanor's hand began to treat her with a distant courtesy. The kind of politeness that announces expulsion before signing. The emerald necklace disappeared from her neck on the third day. Not out of humility, but because she began to feel that each shining stone seemed to accuse her. Andrew, isolated in his father's old study, tried to call Elisa every day. But the calls didn't go through. He sent flowers that were returned without a note. He sent a letter that Michael received, registered, and only delivered after Elisa asked for it. The envelope lay on the table for hours. When she finally opened it, Elisa found fewer apologies than she expected, and more fear than she desired. Andrew wrote that he no longer knew where his will ended, and his mother's voice began. He said he remembered the first time Elisa laughed in the car coming back from Boston. And that now that memory humiliated him more than any separation. Elisa read to the end. She didn't cry. Folded the letter. And said, "He's just beginning to understand. But understanding doesn't undo it." Octavius Ferraz heard that sentence from the doorway and felt that his daughter had surpassed a place where he himself still stumbled. For him, the most difficult impulse to curb was to end everything, with the force of a man accustomed to moving entire structures. He wanted to demand everything. Win everything. Make every person who had touched Elisa feel the same powerlessness he felt seeing her stand pale after the fall. But Elisa didn't want to be a monument to her father's revenge. That night, she called him to talk on the enclosed balcony, where New York City sparkled like a restless machine. "Dad, I know you want to protect me," she began. Octavius replied. "I want to reclaim the years I thought distance was respect." Elisa touched his hand. "You can't reclaim me by controlling me now." The sincerity hurt him. But he didn't look away. "I'm afraid of making mistakes again." She smiled joylessly. "Then make mistakes by listening to me. Not by deciding for me." Octavius held his daughter's hand carefully. The man who was feared by bankers, businessmen, and entire boards, finally did the most difficult thing for someone like him. He stayed quiet and listened. The formal separation proceeded with less scandal than the press desired, and more dignity than the Ferraz family deserved. Michael conducted each step with almost surgical precision, always asking Elisa before any move. Her son's assets were protected by legal measures. Attempts at defamation were documented, and the recording of the dining room remained under seal, available only for necessary proceedings. Elisa refused to turn her pain into a leaked video. "My son will not grow up finding his mother's fall as internet entertainment," she affirmed. This decision confused many people. Some called her weak for not exposing everything. Others strategic for holding on to the evidence. The truth was simpler and harder. Elisa didn't want her freedom to be born from the same cruelty that had hurt her. Michael understood before anyone else. "You're protecting yourself too," he said. After a short meeting at Ferraz Capital's office, Elisa looked out the window at Fifth Avenue, where people crossed the street without imagining how many invisible wars happened behind the tall glass buildings. "I'm trying to learn not to abandon myself again." Andrew asked to see her one last time before the preliminary settlement hearing. Michael advised against it. Octavius hated the idea, but Elisa accepted with clear conditions: neutral location, close team, brief conversation. And no physical contact. They met in a private room at the law firm itself. Without excessive luxury. Just a table. 2 chairs. And a side window. Andrew entered. Thinner? Unshaven. Without his aggressive former brilliance. When he saw her, he stopped as if he had found not his wife, but the living consequence of everything he had denied. "Thank you for agreeing," he said. Elisa nodded. "Don't confuse it with a fresh start." He lowered his eyes. "I know." For a few seconds. The silence carried all the lost dinners. All the forgotten appointments. All the times she had waited for him to choose to be better before it was too late. Andrew took a deep breath. "I didn't come to ask you to come back. I wanted to say that I will take responsibility for what I did." Elisa watched him cautiously. Take responsibility before whom? He swallowed hard. "Before the company. Before the law. Before my family. Before our son. When he grows up." The word "our" no longer sounded like possession, it sounded like a debt. Elisa felt the old part of herself try to search for the man she had loved within that tired face. There were traces of him there. Perhaps there always had been. But traces couldn't sustain a home. "Andrew. I truly loved you," she said. And he closed his eyes as if the sentence stung more than an accusation. "That's why I stayed longer than I should have. That's why I tried to translate contempt as pressure. Absence as work. Silence. As effets. But love cannot be a place where a woman has to diminish herself to fit." Andrew let a tear fall without trying to hide it. "I wish I had understood sooner." Elisa replied with firm gentleness. "Me too. But now I need to choose the woman I want my son to know." He slowly nodded. "And she can't be my wife." Elisa took a deep breath. There was no scream. No slammed door. Just the final word of a story that had ended before either of them had the courage to admit it. When Andrew left, Michael waited in the hallway but asked nothing. Elisa leaned against the wall for a moment. "It hurt less than I feared," she murmured. Michael replied softly. "Sometimes, that's how we know we've survived." Mrs. Eleanor didn't have the same courage. When she was removed from family decisions and summoned to provide clarification on internal documents, she tried to blame consultants, advisors, old lawyers, even Sylvia. But each attempt revealed more the extent of her obsession with control. The woman who feared being replaced ended up alone in a too-large room. Surrounded by portraits of ancestors who could no longer defend her. Her punishment came not as a public scene of humiliation, but as a loss of influence. Invitations stopped arriving. Allies stopped answering. Andrew himself, still broken, refused her guidance for the first time in his life. "I spent years obeying you and called it loyalty," he said in a conversation no one recorded. "Now I need to discover who I am without your voice." Mrs. Eleanor replied that he was betraying his blood. Andrew Pal merely shook his head. "No. I'm trying to prevent that disease from passing to my son." It was the first truly free sentence he had uttered in years. And perhaps the first Mrs. Eleanor couldn't overcome. Months later, Elisa opened the doors to a new office on Fifth Avenue. It wasn't a gigantic headquarters, nor a monument to the Ferret's name. It was a bright floor, with consultation rooms, a legal team, partner, psychologists, and a small space to welcome women who needed to leave homes that were beautiful on the outside and dangerous on the inside. The foundation bore her mother's name, Elena Ferraz, not Elisas Octavius. Upon seeing the plaque, I was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't approve. Then he touched the letters with his fingertips and said, "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." Elisa smiled. Moved. "I'm still becoming." Michael arrived shortly after, bringing documents and strong coffee from a nearby deli too simple for the sophisticated building. Perfect for her, he had remained by Elisa's side during those months. Without pressuring. Without promising quick cures. Without turning gratitude into debt. This patience frightened her less each day. When he handed her the cup, their fingers almost touched. And both noticed. This time, Elisa didn't pull back out of fear, she just smiled gently. "You always wait for me to choose. Don't you, Michael?" he replied. "After everything, I think loving you begins with respecting your choice." Elisa's son was born on a clear morning. After a long and exhausting night at a private New York City hospital, where Octavius walked the corridor like any nervous grandfather, unable to control time, doctors, or his own heart. Andrew was notified when mother and baby were safe. He didn't enter the room without permission. He sent un simple message. Without drama. "Thank you for letting me know he was born." Elisa read it. Looked at the sleeping boy in her arms. And replied only that when the right time came, he could meet him according to the agreed rules. No cruel punishment. No easy forgiveness. Just boundaries. Octavius entered slowly. His eyes moist before his grandson. "He's too small for so much history," Elisa whispered, kissing her son's forehead. "Then we'll give him a better story from now on." Michael stood at the door with white flowers in his hands, unsure whether he should enter. Elisa looked at him and after an instant said, "You can come in." It wasn't a grand declaration, it was an open door. For Michael, it was enough. The afternoon she returned home. Elisa didn't choose the Faraz mansion, nor any apartment bought to impress. She chose her own bright place, with wide windows and a balcony big enough for plants, future toys, and good silence. Octavius complained that the elevator was too small. Michael laughed for the first time without hiding it. And Elisa felt a strange peace, seeing boxes scattered on the floor. It wasn't the perfect house. It was the house where no one would demand she sign away her own presence. As night fell, when New York City lit up again, she stayed alone for a few minutes, with her son in her lap. She thought of the Faraz dining room. The fall. Her father's phrase. Andrew's hand. Michael's firmness. Her own voice saying, "No." The pain still existed, but it no longer commanded. Elisa touched the Faraz ring. Then looked at the baby's small hand, holding her finger. "You'll never have to kneel to be loved," she promised. Outside, the city remained noisy, indifferent, and alive. Inside that new home, Elisa finally understood that she hadn't been rescued by a family name, by a powerful father, or by a patient man. She had been rescued the instant she decided not to abandon herself anymore. 3 years later, Elisa Faraz no longer startled at the sound of doors opening behind her. Before, any abrupt step made her body remember the Faraz dining room, the cold marble, the long table, Andrew's hand, and the fear of falling while holding her own belly. Now, on that clear morning in New York City, the sound coming from the hallway was just her son running with non-slip socks through the house, laughing as if the world had never tried to hurt his mother. Gabriel had the curious eyes of someone who questioned everything and the easy smile of someone growing up surrounded by healthy boundaries. Elisa was in the kitchen, wearing a simple white shirt, making coffee while mentally reviewing that afternoon's meeting at the Helena Faraz Institute. The place she had created to welcome women, victims of domestic violence, already served dozens of families a month. It wasn't a PR project. It wasn't a response to the newspapers. It was a promise transformed into an address. Michael Arantes arrived a few minutes later with a briefcase of documents in one hand and a small wooden car in the other. Gabriel ran to him and asked if lawyers also knew how to play. Michael knelt down seriously, as if he were before a tribunal, and replied that only good lawyers knew how to negotiate with toy cars. Elisa heard from the kitchen and smiled before she even realized it. There was a different peace in that kind of love. Michael had never tried to take anyone's place. Never demanded haste. Never used care as currency. Never confused presence with possession. He had simply stayed. And on certain days, staying with respect was the greatest declaration anyone could offer. Andrew also existed in that new life, but in a different place. After fulfilling the legal requirements, withdrawing from the decisions of the old company, and beginning a long process of personal reconstruction, he started seeing Gabriel in supervised meetings at first, then in arranged visits. He never again raised his voice to Elisa. Never again tried to call her his wife. The first time Gabriel called him Dad, Andrew cried silently. Not from pure happiness, but from conscience. He had learned late that fatherhood was not an automatic right. It was a daily responsibility. Mrs. Eleanor lived apart from the circles where she once reigned. She still carried pride, but she no longer had enough of an audience to turn it into power. The Faraz name continued to exist, but without the same untouchable aura. Some said Elisa had destroyed that family. She knew she hadn't. A family doesn't destroy itself when a woman tells the truth. It merely stops hiding the cracks. That afternoon, during a lecture at the institute, Elisa stood before a small group of women. Some wore expensive clothes. Others came straight from work. Others held children in their laps. All had in common that look of someone still trying to understand if pain could also be a beginning. Elisa didn't recount the details of her own fall. She didn't need to. She simply said, sometimes, violence begins long before the push. It begins when you start apologizing for existing. It begins when your voice becomes an inconvenience. When your pain becomes an exaggeration. When your dignity depends on another person's mood. And it ends when you understand that leaving is not failing. Leaving can be the first proof of love for yourself. In the back of the room, Octavius Faraz listened to his daughter with tearful eyes. He no longer looked like the invincible man who had arrived with lawyers at a Hamptons mansion. He looked merely like an aging father, marked by what he almost lost, and transformed by what he learned. When Elisa stepped down from the stage, he held her hand and said, "Today, you protected more people than I could protect with all my money." Elisa replied, "Because protection without listening can also become a prison." "Dad." Octavius nodded. This time, he understood. Later at home, Gabriel fell asleep on the sofa, holding the wooden car. Michael covered the boy with a blanket and looked at Elisa. "Are you doing okay today?" she thought before answering. "I used to say yes to not worry anyone. Now I tell the truth. I'm strong." "Well, I'm still learning." Michael approached slowly. "Can I learn with you?" Elisa smiled. It was no longer the smile of someone who needed to please, it was the smile of a whole woman. Outside, New York City shone with its usual haste. But inside that home, no one needed to shout to be heard. No one needed to kneel to be loved. And Elisa, looking at her son, at her father, at Michael, and at herself, reflected in the window glass, understood that the true victory hadn't been seeing the Faraz's fall. The true victory was waking up every day in a life where she could stand tall without asking permission. This story has an educational and entertainment purpose. On the entertainment side, it uses strong elements of American family drama, modern romance, corporate elite, family secrets, emotional twists, and ultimate justice. The narrative was constructed to captivate the audience, with intense scenes, striking dialogues, power conflicts, and a protagonist who transforms from a silenced woman to someone capable of deciding her own destiny. On the educational side, the story addresses domestic violence, emotional abuse, family manipulation, financial control, and the importance of recognizing boundaries within a relationship. Elisa's fall represents not just a physical act, but the culmination of a series of humiliations, blackmail, and attempts to silence her voice. The central message is that no woman should be treated as property, a bargaining chip, or an instrument to protect a family name. The story also demonstrates that asking for help is not a weakness. Elisa receives support from her father, Michael, the legal team, and healthcare professionals. But the main decisions come from her. This is important because the protagonist is not merely saved by someone powerful. She chooses to leave, chooses to speak, chooses to protect her child, and chooses to rebuild her own life with dignity. Another educational point is the difference between justice and revenge. Octavius had the power to immediately destroy the Faraz family. But Elisa chooses the path of law, truth, and protection. This reinforces the idea that confronting abuse does not have to mean becoming like the abuser. The character's true strength lies in not allowing pain to turn her humanity into cruelty. The story also offers a reflection on parenthood, regret, and consequences. Andrew is not easily forgiven, because the narrative does not romanticize violence. He may regret. He may try to change. But that doesn't erase what he did. Elisa's love for him is not used as an excuse for her to return to a dangerous environment. This choice teaches that forgiveness, when it exists, should not annul boundaries. For the audience, this work can be seen as an emotional drama about a pregnant woman humiliated by her husband's family. But behind the twists and turns, the main theme is self-esteem, protection, courage, and freedom. It is a story about understanding that a beautiful house can hide pain, that a powerful family name is not worth more than a person's dignity, and that no relationship deserves to be maintained when it demands that someone abandon themselves to continue being loved.